This is a Federal News Network podcast.
For the Army, the command post of the future will need to be agile, resilient, and intuitive. It will be a big lift not only for the Army, but for the contractors who are building the technology to support it. For more on the Army's efforts to modernize its approach to command and control, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me to discuss. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Eric.
So how is the Army setting expectations for the command and control capabilities of the future?
Well, just last week, Army Chief of Staff General Randy George signed off on something called the Next Generation Command and Control Capability Characteristics. The Army simplified it to say C2 Next. Thank goodness for the Army and their acronyms. Now, they released this, and I'll use quotes in release, Eric, because they put it on SAM.gov, a notice to say the characteristics of need are available, but vendors have to, quote unquote, again, apply to see them. So they're not as public as maybe I would have hoped, but I was able to get a little more details because, again, General George, speaking at the Army TEMS conference in Philadelphia last week, talked about this, as did a bunch of others. He says with the network being the Army's top priority, these new characteristics are a key building block.
I was out at NTC in, I think it was March, for Project Convergence. And, one of the things that I challenged everybody a year ago, and especially AFC, was saying, hey, I want to be able to be on the network, and I want us to be able to operate with tablets, phones, software-defined radios, very simple architecture. And what I saw when I was out there in March is that the tech exists now to do those kinds of things. We had a platoon leader talking to a company commander, talking to a battalion commander, talking to a brigade commander, and they were talking on tablets. All those big systems that we used to have, AFATEDS is one of them, can be an app, and it can be on that tablet. So rather than having a truck or 2 trucks and 10 people, you have an application.
Now, George says the commanders were excited about these capabilities because it means speeds the decision and a better decision-making process, but also makes them more lethal, which is always a big thing for the Army.
Got it. So they didn't make a lot of these characteristics public. What do we actually know about C2 Next and what it means?
It's very frustrating they didn't make these public, and maybe there are sensitive reasons why. Maybe there's some cybersecurity, for lack of a better word, sensitive reasons. But still, at the Army TEMS conference last week, they did give us a little bit of a preview. So let me tell you what we know, Eric. First of all, I heard from Joe Welch, the Director of Command Control, Communications, Computers, Cyber Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance Center, or C5ISR for the Army Combat Capabilities Development Command. Now, he says what's in the characteristics are not just capabilities to build or to have, but really give the commanders the ability to tailor and adapt C2 for what they need for their staff based on the needs of information and requirements. Now, he says the characteristics aren't even necessarily the nuts and bolts of the capabilities of the systems, but he outlines several focus areas that are under the C2 Next characteristics.
Moving down in the stack, we start getting into sort of what we talk about as transport here. So robust, resilient, those were key ones. And we've been making lots of progress in terms of that, not just in the variety of transport paths that we have for our networks to be able to support data transmission, but to do it in an automated way and to do it in a highly secure way. I see this as a continued evolution, integrating, in fact, in the characteristics of need, it talks specifically about being threat informed in this area. So we kind of started from a perspective of we just need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to get the data where it needs to go in order to accomplish the mission.
Again, C5ISR Director Joe Welch. A second area that's going to be critical, Welch says, is a robust services architecture that is, of course, cloud native. It won't always be in the cloud, but it has to be easily in the cloud. And it's based on open systems standards to enable what they say is easy iteration of capabilities.
And the last thing, and this has been a consistent theme here recently, is as a service. And we're seeing that in more and more areas. And I guess what's really meant by that is that we don't want to be fixed on any particular thing. We want to be able to experiment, prototype, move very quickly into deployment, and use something as long as it's working, and be able to challenge it when there's something that's better out there, when the need changes or the technology changes. And that gets into a lot more mechanics than the concepts or the capabilities that we're describing, but it's a very fundamental underpinning of where we're looking to go.
Again, C5ISR Director Joe Welch speaking at the Army TEMS conference last week. Now, he says C2 Next is part of a necessary and complete revamp of the Army generates, produces, consumes, discovers data, and it's necessary in order to apply machine learning and other emerging technologies to all of it. He says if the Army wants to be able to do informed and enabled decision-making much faster than the adversary, then these characteristics of needs obviously will play a huge role going forward.
We're speaking with Federal News Network executive editor Jason Miller. So this is a massive undertaking if they want to change pretty much how the Army operates in general. What have they been doing to test these concepts over the last few months?
There's been, of course, several exercises, demonstrations. Our Army has been starting with several concepts, improving upon them as they went along. And Eric, here's a great example. At the recent Project Convergence, an annual technology and capability demonstration effort, Dr. Jean Vitale, the next generation C2 chief scientist for experimentation at the Army's Capabilities Command for C5ISR, says they actually measured some of the benefits of these C2 Next characteristics.
In the characteristics of need, you'll see that we'll talk a lot about modularity, or this really focus we have on composability. What does that actually mean? So I wanted to actually pull from yesterday just to help synthesize across these sessions. So yesterday, the commanders were talking about how they did a bunch of movement for the command post where they changed from 6 hours down to 15 minutes. And then within that, they then had 16 Raspberry Pis that they put out where they emulated the electromagnetic signature of the CP as decoys.
Now, the idea here, Eric, was to protect the command and control technologies from jamming or other types of cyber attacks. Hence, using these things called Raspberry Pis. They're very small computers that are very nimble and agile. You can kind of make them to what you want them to be. Now, Vitale says this is an example of how the next C2 characteristics really are going to emphasize adaptability.
If it's adaptable, that means that in the fight, whenever a peer adversary now has identified that we're creating our decoys with electromagnetic signatures, then our warfighters need to have access to data that they couldn't tell us beforehand, we being engineers, right beforehand, that they needed. But they have the ability to know what data they have available and how it is that they can try to spoof or create a different decoy because they've access to the data, because it's adaptable to what they need to fight the peer adversary.
Again, Dr. Jean Vitale, the next generation C2 chief scientist for experimentation at the Army Capabilities Command. She says this example also shows that building capabilities in modules, the modularity piece that she talked about, can be those that can be plugged in, removed, changed as necessary. Again, another key piece that they have demonstrated at this recent Project Convergence.
All right, so they've put out these C2 Next characteristics. What is next on the docket? Are they going to actually be applying these more and more and maybe even share some more details with folks?
They definitely want some comments from industry. They want people to review them, not just industry, but other folks in the Army. And I think that they're definitely going to continue to test and refine them. And in fact, Joe Welch, again, the director of the C5ISR, says the intent is to make the C2 Next characteristics a living document that will be updated every 6 months or so.
I think what you'll see is the characteristics of need, which may sound very principled and very large overarching statements. I'm expecting that they're going to get iterated into some greater and greater levels of detail as we continue through next generation C2 experimentation. And so I guess what I would say in terms of what's ahead is you'll hear more of the details from the panel, but we're certainly moving fast and in alignment with the chief's objective to be moving with speed and urgency. We're going to be moving in conjunction with our partners within ASALT as we look toward beyond experimentation, prototyping, into delivery of next generation C2 capability.
Additionally, the Army Futures Command is in the early stages of actually planning a new contract vehicle to help bring these C2 Next characteristics into technology capabilities and to get some support for them. So a lot more to come, Eric. This is a step of a long journey, but in many ways, this is, for the Army, very exciting.
Federal News Network executive editor Jason Miller, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Leadership today, especially within the federal workforce, is being tested more than ever before. After a storied career at the IRS and years of working as a union representative, Doreen Greenwald was elected National President of the National Treasury Employees Union. Greenwald joined Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, to discuss how to foster an environment where diverse perspectives are not just heard but valued, and how she harnesses the richness of experience from federal employees across numerous agencies.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today I'm joined by Doreen Greenwald, National President of the National Treasury Employees Union. Doreen, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Shane. It's great to be here.
You've been a leader